Hello, everyone, and welcome to Claris Community Live. I'm Rosemary Teege, Community Manager at Claris, and today it's my pleasure to welcome Jeremy Brown from JavaScript and FM and Marc Larochelle from Productive Computing. And we're going to take a deep dive on the new persistent data store feature in FileMaker 2026. And before we get started, as always, please take a couple seconds to fill out our poll. I see several of you are already doing that, and thank you. That just helps my guests know a little bit more about where you are in experience with this feature. And also, I just want to make a quick announcement that we released FileMaker 26.0.2 yesterday, and that's an update for Pro, Server, and Go. It's currently available on downloads.claris.com, which I'm dropping into the chat right now if you aren't familiar with that link. And it should be available in Pro through the software update later today. And there was also, if you're still running in FileMaker 22 or 2025, there's also an update for Pro and Server that encompasses a lot of security fixes. So we do recommend that you apply that patch, even if you're not yet ready to move to FileMaker 2026. And so with that, Marc and Jeremy, do you want to give a quick hello and introduce yourselves?
Sure. I guess I'll go, and then this is Marc Larochelle from Productive Computing, and we have been a Claris Platinum partner for years now. For many years, I started in FileMaker in 1991. We currently offer hosting, custom dev. We've been making plugins for years, since 1998 in the industry, QuickBooks, Outlook, things like that. Most recently, we're working on Productive Computing University, where we provide extra training for the Claris platform. So,
Jeremy.
Hi there, I'm Jeremy Brown. I am on my own. I work, Integrating Magic is my company name, but I do a lot more with JS and FM. We have our own community that talks specifically about this. We have training and weekly office hours, and we're still learning about JavaScript in this age of agentic coding and everything being done by AI. We're still trying to learn about JavaScript. So that's who I am.
All right, and just to let you know, we've had about 75 people complete the poll. And in terms of multiple choice, what version of FileMaker are you currently using? And this was a select all. You can apply. Almost 80% of you are using FileMaker 2026 in some capacity, about half 2025, and then, everybody, there's still also a good portion using all the other older versions. And 80% of people have not yet touched the persistent data store. 15% have kicked the tires, and a handful have started using it. And finally, where people stash their apps' odds and ends, 60% use a settings table, 25% are using a global field, and then 10% said, I'd rather not say. And there's a few people also
It's a secret.
custom functions. So I'll leave the poll up for another 10 minutes or so. And as always, if you have questions during today's session, please drop them in chat. Be sure to send them to everyone, because our smart people in the audience will frequently get to answers before I can interrupt and ask Marc or Jeremy. And as always, also, the session is being recorded and will be up on the Claris YouTube channel later today. So as we get started, Marc, do you want to just start and talk about, and actually Marc and Jeremy both, talk a little bit about what the persistent data store is and kind of where it came from, why did we add it to FileMaker, and what's the as you understand it, vision behind it?
I'll quickly say what it is, and I'll let Jeremy talk about perhaps why it was added to FileMaker. Persistent data is another place to store information. It's the first time we've had anything like this. And the unique thing about it is it doesn't require a table or fields, a layout or relationships or table occurrences. It doesn't exist in any of that traditional schema that we think of. It's a separate place, but it is stored in the file. And when you make a change to the persistent store, it will update the file and anyone connected to it. So that's essentially what it is. It's a different place. It's a new place to store data. And the persistent aspect of it is it means that when you close the file and open it again, the data is still there. So unlike a variable where it's temporary, a single dollar variable would be temporary to the script or to a calc. The double dollar variable is persistent to the file for the session. Persistent data lasts through all of that. It lasts in the file itself across restarts, whether it's hosted or not, it's just there. It's invisible in a sense, but it's there. So why it was created, I'll let Jeremy talk about that.
Hi there. Persistent data is such a unique new feature for us. It's really one of those game changers that we saw with JSON, the JSON functions and the execute data API. I think it's the first time that we've been able to store, other than custom functions, I guess, we've been able to store something in the guts of FileMaker itself. That may not be fully true, but it certainly is one of the more accessible places, the place that we can get to using these functions. I think it was created because people like me who work with JavaScript all the time and HTML, we have been storing our code inside of either layout objects or insert text variable script steps, or in tables and layouts and and table occurrences. And every time we saw a Claris developer, we were like, when are we getting a better place to store this? Since the data migration tool has come about and cloning, we certainly can't keep the code that we have stored in tables. So we have been asking for a place for it. So I assume this was part of the reason why. A long time ago, I think I heard of it being talked about a triple dollar sign or a quadruple dollar sign. But regardless, we have it now. I think, Mark, I think that the reason why this came about now is because of what's coming in the future. This is a perfect place for agentic coding to stuff its code, the code that it generates, or the whatever it generates, and allows then FileMaker, a web viewer, or whatever, to reach that. So I don't know exactly what the vision of it, except for people like me to stop hounding the Claris developers in giving us a better place to store HTML code. That's what I think. Do you think that's true, Mark? Have you
I
seen
think
what the agentic coding does and where does it put stuff?
Yeah, I think when you say agentic coding, and you'll be demonstrating this later on, it reduces the handcuffs that we have from a context standpoint. It sort of exists without the usual context requirements of go to layout, go here, pull that. So it's just in the file. So as long as you're in the file, you've got what you need. And that sort of goes hand in hand with the agentic coding and what it needs.
Yeah.
So yeah, I totally agree with that.
All right, so why don't we start to take a deeper dive into how it works. We'll go through the anatomy and a little bit about capabilities and limits, and then I'll weave the questions that have come in so far into that conversation. Yeah, so there's really only 3 things you need to learn, right, Mark? There's a script step and 2 calculations.
Right.
Do you just want to take us through those?
Sure. I'd be happy to. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, you should see the beginnings of a FileMaker database here. I'm going to create a brand new database file. And I'll call it test and put it on my desktop. And I'm going to purposely remove the one table that it created, just to kind of prove the point. that what we're going to do today has nothing to do with the traditional schema that we normally think of. So now I've got a blank file. Now I do have a layout, and but that's not as important right now. Let's just look at how to store persistent data. So you will need a script step to store it. So I'll create a new script, call it test. And you can bring up this script step just by typing in PERS for persistent, and it should bring up the one item here that you need to think about, which is configure persistent data. Within that script step, there are really only 3 things you need to know about, 4 if you count delete. The first thing is what's called a name. And this is an area, it's totally flexible. You can name it whatever you want. It doesn't have a calculation dialog box, you'll notice here. So you can't calculate the name, but you can name it what you want. And what you'll see here, Jeremy and I have been, in a sense, using the same data name or the same name each time we set it up, just to keep it easy to remember, but you're not restricted by that. You can call it what you want. You can have as many as you want. For now, I'll call it data. Probably a bad name for it. Let me call it company prefs. And that'll be my name. Notice I have a space there. It's not sensitive to any of that. The next thing you need to know about is the instance ID. And this is available from the traditional calculation dialog box. So you can either hard code information or you can make it dynamic. So this is the actual ID that you'll be storing your information. You could make it generic and just put a 1 there or put just a word, or you could make it dependent on an ID that comes from your actual FileMaker file. For example, if you wanted persistent data somehow associated with a record, you could put a record ID in there. You could put a unique key in there. You could put a name. For example, if you wanted to store preferences and you wanted to put the account name of the person that's currently logged in, you could do that. And that could be your ID for the storage information. For now, I'll keep it simple and just hard code the number 1. And then finally, the last thing is the value, which is the actual data you want to store. It's text-based, so whatever you can dream of that can fit inside a text embodiment, you're good to go. It could be a single word, it could be a bunch of words, it could be a string of characters, it could be a carriage return list, it could be a JSON, a giant JSON payload. So for now, I'll also keep it simple, and we'll just say that this company prefs, we want to store something in ID 1, and that storage will be, let's say, Pacific, as if it was the Pacific time zone. And that's all I'm going to store. So I'll push OK, and then I'll execute that script step. So now it's in there. Now you don't see that it's in there. There's nothing visible to see at this moment. So in order to gather this information or to be aware of it, I'll go to Tools and I'll go to the Data Viewer and I'll add a new expression. And this is where we're going to look at one of the functions to pull information on persistent data. So here again, you can type in PERS for persistent, and you'll get 2 things. You'll get persistent data, which is one function, and the other one is list persistent data IDs. We'll look at that second one in a minute. Let's look at the first one, get persistent data. It needs to know 2 things. It needs to know the name of what we called it. So I'll put in there company prefs, and I'll put that in quotes because it's a name. And then the instance ID is 1. That's what we had there. I'm getting a question mark, I think.
Did you call it prefs, Mark?
I did, prefs, you're right. So back here.
No,
Maybe I didn't execute it.
There we go.
Ah, okay, I just didn't execute the script that I thought I did. I saved it, but I didn't execute it. So now inside this information here, I have Pacific. So it's return Pacific. Now you can take that a step further. You could put JSON in there and put multiple pieces of information, all in the same ID, or you could choose to use different IDs and store your information that way. I think the hardest decision you'll have is deciding exactly how best to construct your data, because it's completely flexible. I mean, almost too flexible to a point. So that's the first function. If you know the name and you know the ID, it'll get the data for you. Now, I would like to do another storage. I'll double this. I'll say what I want to do is I want to put two pieces of information here by way of two different IDs in the same namespace. So let me show you. I'll duplicate this script step. And we'll go to the second one, and I'll leave the name the same. I'll say company prefs. We're going to put it to the exact same location. The difference here is I will use a different ID, and I'll use a different piece of information. So let's say ID 2 is going to be Eastern. Okay, so now I'm setting it twice, same name, two different IDs. So I'll execute that, and then we'll go back to our data viewer and take a look. So now I have Pacific here in 1, and then if I go to 2, I have Eastern. So now let's bring up our other option, which is another function that allows you to get all the IDs in that persistent location, that persistent data location known as company prefs. So again, I'll put in PERS for persistent, and I'll say list persistent data IDs. Here it only needs one piece of information, and that is what I'm calling the namespace, the name of what we call that area. So I'll put in here, quote, company prefs, and it shows me the two IDs that I used. So in a sense, it's a way to retrieve all the keys for that area of the persistent data. Once you know the name, once you know the ID, you can get any piece of the data that you've stored. So this is where the conundrum comes. Do you put everything in one ID in a giant JSON object so that you can sort of have everything in one place? Or do you put multiple IDs depending on what you want? You could also put multiple names. So for example, you could have a persistent data dedicated to company prefs. You could have another set for user prefs. You could have another set for temporary storage. You could have another set for a swap table that you've created by gathering data from the server, putting it in persistent data swap tables, and then having it there. I see the questions coming in fast and furious.
Yes, so I think I'm just roll back to the top of the questions. And the first one, is it backwards compatible with older versions of FileMaker?
It
No.
is. It's not for the file. It is okay for the server. You can store a file that's opened in FileMaker 2026 on a server that is less than 2026. You just can't use any of the functions up on server. But no, you can't use it other than FileMaker 2026.
Yeah, and so what you're saying though is, just to be clear, you can't access it with an older version, but having persistent data stored in a file will not cause problems for opening the file with, for example, Pro 2025 or 2024.
Unless the point is to use the data that's stored in there, right? Which yeah.
Lots of questions about, can data from file A be accessed from file B? So is persistent data used across files in a multi-file solution?
It is not. It's not. You can only do it via a script, which would kind of defeat the maybe not defeat the purpose of this, but since it is a calculation for that file, it's only available for that file. Just like themes and pretty much everything else that's stored in XML, there are things that are available, like tables and table occurrences and scripts, but certainly not this. No.
Yeah. Next question is, I'm just going to laugh because we had a conversation amongst ourselves as we were warming up about this one. And is there a max size for a specific entry in the persistent data store?
I have not found one. I have my examples that I'll show. There's 11 widgets. Each has about 200,000 characters. They're all stored in the same place. I haven't had any issues. So one instance, I don't know what but all of them together, doesn't seem to be a limit at the moment.
Same. I haven't found a limit. I've been wanting to get time to test that. I'd like to get over 10 million characters, but I definitely know 3 million or more has been no problem so far.
Yep. And I was going to fire off a question to Clay, but he's at full access today, so he probably wouldn't have been available to answer it first thing this morning. But what I will do is I'll take that question back to the engineering team and watch the community thread for this episode early next week, and I will hopefully be able to share an answer there. There's a couple best practice questions that I'm going to hold for the end because we have plans to talk at length about best practices. And then also, there's a function, a couple of people have asked, how do you get the names of configured persistent data? That's been, I think that was a feature request that came out in the community probably right after we released FileMaker 2026. And yes, a couple people said, yes, you can retrieve them using save a copy as XML.
Right. And I have it on the screen here. I'll just show you quickly. It's save a copy as XML.
Yeah.
You have your test file, and the one you want to focus on, I'll just deselect these all, except for the one that we're talking about.
I don't know.
Yeah.
My mouse isn't working today. Okay. There we go. And the one you want is persistent data store, this one here.
Yeah.
So if you export that, that becomes an XML file that you can look at and see all the areas. The entire persistent store will be available to you that way. It'll be an XML. And just a pro tip, if you take that XML file and throw it into, your favorite AI tool, you can have it extract the data however you want.
It's a best practice, or we'll talk about best practices later as far as the names. I don't feel necessarily the need to get a function that gets the names, because in all that I will do, I will only use one name my entire time. Even if I might use maybe a preferences one and a widgets one, but I don't see myself needing a lot of different names. I certainly will have a lot of instance IDs, which is why I think we have that function. But as far as a name, yeah, I don't know. Mark, do you see any reason to have multiple names or namespaces in there?
Not really. I mean, if a person is really adept at JSON and that's the world they live in on a regular basis, I think having one name and having everything in one giant payload or with multiple IDs, it's probably more than enough. And I kind of applaud what you're doing there, Jeremy, because you're keeping it simple, less for the developer to have to worry about. I can also see a really sophisticated file possibly wanting different named areas so that on the one hand, they're protecting this data, like a swap table, and they might want a completely different namespace just for the clarity of separation. Mm-hmm. But, the more you separate, the more you have to keep track of later on too. So
you build a table to keep track of your data names, right?
You create schema to not have to store schema.
There you go. That's what you do.
All right. Well, now that we've seen the building blocks and talked a little bit about, this is something you can use to store company preferences or JavaScript, HTML widgets. I think you both have polished demos to share. And why don't you, Mark, go ahead and show your...
So yeah, I have a file here that's available to demonstrate how you might use this for storing company preferences in a file here in FileMaker. And I called it persistent data company prefs. And if I look under the hood, I do have a table, it's called main, and I do have a single field called logo. And the only reason I created a field here was so that we could see the logo after retrieving it from persistent data so that you guys could appreciate, okay, it can handle logos as well in terms of what you can store. So, and also in my layout, I have a layout calculation, and its only job is to use those functions that you saw earlier, where we got the persistent data through a function, and it's going to display the persistent data here once we retrieve it. So now I'm going to show you how to potentially collect this data, and I've got a button up here called prefs, and I'll click on that button. Now what this button has done is it's opened another window, so nothing fancy there. And inside this window, I have a single web viewer. And a lot of you are already familiar with this style of programming, but it's definitely up and coming and will be our future. This file is an HTML. What you're looking at is HTML and JavaScript to collect company preferences. So there's no fields here. It's just a web page inside my FileMaker file. So I can say test company, and I can change the different preferences that we might ask a user in a typical system, date formats, things like that, emails, business hours, and then even a logo. So I'll click this button to get a logo in here. So again, I still haven't left this web page. And I have two options here. I have a cancel button. The cancel button won't do anything. It won't even fire a script. It'll simply close the window. It'll fire a script to close the window. The save button will also fire a script in FileMaker, and it will collect the data from this form. And with that data, the very first thing it's going to do is store that data into the persistent store. Then it'll close the window. After the window is closed, it tells the layout calc to update with a quick refresh object. And then the layout calc, its job is to pull whatever's in persistent store for the company preferences. So it's sort of a round trip. So I'll hit save now. It closed the window, stored the data, and then presented it back to me in a way that I can get to it under my normal day-to-day programming. If I need it on a layout, if I need it on an invoice, I have all of that there at the ready. And in order to gather that, I didn't have to create a global field. I didn't have to create a global relationship. Now, with one exception, the logo is in a global field because the only way to display a picture in FileMaker on a layout is using a container field. So that's the only thing you see here, but the rest of this is just a layout calc pulling the preferences. So if I go to Tools and go to Debugger, I could get to that data, from the data viewer, from a calc, from anywhere. And the reason I'm showing you this here on the layout, this layout calc, is just a way to get the data. I think the interesting thing about this is maybe just to quickly look under the hood to see how the script is constructed. There's two scripts. One opens the preferences window. So let's just talk about that quickly. We open a new window. Then the next step is the insert text script step, which a lot of people are starting to use now to store HTML. And that HTML, I didn't create that by hand. I simply went to my favorite AI and I said, okay, build me an HTML page that's compatible with FileMaker Web Viewer. Here are the fields I want. And then it builds it. I maybe tweak it the way it looks. And then once that's happy, I just copy and paste it right into here. And Jeremy's going to show you some other even better ways to handle that kind of interface. So it creates the HTML, sets it in a field or in a variable. And then here, step 4, that's where the web viewer will update from that collection. So it takes that HTML, stuffs it into the web viewer. The web viewer immediately draws the form ready for the user. I do a pause for 0 seconds. That's been my way of making sure that everything refreshes so that it works. I don't know if you guys have found a better way around that, but I've been putting a 0-second pause after I set a web viewer. Yep. And then finally, the really important script step here is one that we've had for a while, perform JavaScript in web viewer. And all it does is it takes the information that I might have already had in persistent data from a previous session and stuffs it inside the web form again, so that when the user goes to the preferences the second time, all that information that we had on file is there. So that's all that this step does, is it takes whatever we had in the company preferences, persistent data area, ID 1, and puts it in, and then the form automatically draws what's there. So that's the first script that sets it up. And then finally, the step that retrieves the data. So now let's assume that the user hits the save button. It runs this script called web save company prefs. And the very first thing it does is it takes that data and puts it right into the persistent store. We already looked at this script step. Here I happen to be using the name company preferences, very similar to my first demo. The ID is 1, And all we're doing is taking the script parameter, which is what the form gives us. So the form sends that information back. We grab it in the script parameter. And now we have all our preferences data stored in that special area. We close the window. We refresh the layout calc so that we can see it. And then finally, it sets the logo with the information from the logo part of the data. And let me open this up a little bit because it is quite interesting. Some people have worked with logos in text, some people haven't. But the idea is it's parsing out the logo portion of the JSON, just where the logo is, and it's putting a name in there so that the logo actually appears. So essentially, it's converting it from base64 to an image. Essentially, what it does, and that's the only difference between handling logos and text. With a logo, you have to make it base64 so that it stores as text, and then retrieve it and do the reverse when you're populating it. So that's that, and then I commit the records, and that's how it works. Lots of questions coming in, I see.
Yes.
Mark, can you go to your screen right here? Can you go to the data viewer?
Sure.
I'm just curious. Normally in this case, we would have a bunch of globals, but I can see in can you show us your current tab? Does it have any globals with all this company information in it? No. So I would say another great advantage of this is it cleans up our data viewer, right? Normally, how many of you have like 50 global variables in there, and your local ones are clear at the bottom, and it's hard to, it's annoying to go through those, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. In fact, there was a question a little earlier about, someone said, I right now run a script on open that sets a bunch of global variables. So how is this an advantage?
Well, this is one advantage. And I would say another one is this is a calculation. So there's no scripting involved to get that information there on the layout or on the invoice. It's a calculation that renders when the layout is visible. So that's a huge advantage. We don't have to rely on a script to get all this stuff set up when it first opens up.
Right. It's available all the time, anytime, from anywhere.
Yep.
So as an example, you say, well, how do I pluck out that persistent data? You just, anywhere you are where there's a calc, just say company preferences. And then we'll put an ID of 1. And there's my persistent data. Not much to look at there. But if let's do a JSON, clean that up a little bit. JSON format elements. Come on. There we go. This will clean it up. There. Now you can start to see the keys of the JSON. So if I want to pluck business hours out, I just can specify that in a normal JSON parse function. So I've got my business hours, company name, currency, date format, language, and logo. The logo is, more of the hieroglyphics of it. It's just the logo. But it's very easy to see that from anywhere at any time, you can just pluck these preferences out of thin air, so long as you're in the file. And now like you said, Jeremy, you don't have to store this in a global variable and have it pollute your data viewer and all that. And everything that Jeremy and I have tested thus far, it's been extremely responsive and very capable. And if we have time later, I'll show you a server-side versus client-side implementation of moving massive amounts of data back and forth using persistent store. And you'll see just how fast it is. Any other questions on this demo?
Nothing specific on this demo. There are a ton of questions, but I think I'm going to let Jeremy show, the kind of core reason for this, which is the storing JavaScript and HTML for layout objects or full layouts to be displayed in the web viewer. And then we can use the questions to kind of guide our further discussion of best practices and other uses.
And before Jeremy starts, I just want to say that this file is available right now as a free lesson inside of a larger course at Productive Computing University. You can get to that. Rosemary, if you still have the link, you can throw it in there. If not,
I
I can do it.
actually already have, and
Oh,
I'm
cool.
having really bad WebEx legs problems right now. So I don't know if the rest of you are seeing it or if it's just my local network. But I'm having problems dropping resources into chat. They
Saw
just
it. I
aren't
saw it.
sticking. So if you guys could do that as well, that would be
Okay,
helpful.
but you already did the main link. Okay.
Yep.
For me. Okay, perfect. Thank you.
All right, Jeremy, let's
All
talk
right.
about JavaScript and widgets and all those things.
So this I have been working with JavaScript in FileMaker for 6 or 7 years now. That's what my business runs on, and we'll see what happens when AI takes over everything. But for now, the way that I work with JavaScript kind of originated when I worked with Todd Geist, when the add-ons were created. The only way to produce at one time the efficient way, I'll say, to produce to have HTML inside of my file was to have a table called, in my case, called HTML, where I'm storing all of the code for the widgets. I have 10 widgets here that are running this student information system database that I created, this file. And this is the way that I currently do this. I don't have a problem with this. There are certain disadvantages and possible some advantages, but this is how I've always stored my HTML. It's all of the code that's been compiled. I use my development environment that compiles the code and then brings it into this file through a scripted process, and it works. Now every layout that I need, like this honor roll layout, it has the web viewer is going to find that data in the HTML stored there, and it's rendering that in the web viewer. So all of my different examples here are using one of those different widgets, and it's just using relationships to do that. This one right here is going through a related record relationship from students here to the HTML set by a widget name field, and it is getting the code that it needs. This works, but it requires a context, and it requires me to have a relationship graph with the students that I was on and a relationship to my HTML table. And that has to be based on a specific widget name field so that then the relationship in the web viewer can find the right code to do its work. This works. It works nicely, but as you can see here, I've got quite a messy graph, but also don't worry about that. The parts in purple are the small pain points. I'm having to add 3 instances of the same table occurrence of the same base table to my graph in order for this to work. One from the student's context, the class's context, and the course's context. So this is before the data storage. This is how I've always run it, and it works really well. I noticed that this file just sitting on my hard drive is about 6.1 megabytes. It's not that big, but with these 10 records of HTML, I have 6.1 megabytes of information. Yeah, I mean, that's not a big deal. I think before I even started this, before I added the HTML, this whole file with all of the actual student data was about 1 megabyte big. Adding all of 10 of these increased the size by 6 times because there's just a lot of code here. This is a calculation, but it does require a relationship, right? It requires that relationship. So if there's any slowness between the relationship, then we just have to deal with that. So this is the old way that I would do it, and the current way, because people are still moving up to 2026. But in the new version, in using FileMaker 2026 and with the data storage, I can remove a lot of what we saw. No longer, and I think Mark pointed this out, no longer do I have a HTML table. He didn't have any table in his first demo. I don't have an HTML table anymore. I just have the actual data that means something to the users of this file. And all I have is all of these widgets stored in the persistent data storage. So what you saw here in these 10 widgets here are now stuck in my persistent data storage area. I actually have a widget that renders that. This widget here is a simple web viewer that goes and fetches the widgets available instance, and it renders all of the widgets that I have in this. It's using that list persistent data IDs, and it's getting the values. I want to point out, in my case, I'm not using numbers for the IDs. I'm using the actual widget name, so I know which ones I am working with. A number I would get confused about, but widgets available is very useful for me to know. This, we'll go to this, let's see, enrollment dashboard. This dashboard right here is just a random context, and it's a simple matter of using that function inside of the web viewer calculation to go to my namespace called widgets and get this particular widget, the HTML from that widget that I need for this particular widget. So now every use of this, if I go to my students, I have one, oh, this one is, let's fix this one. Rather than using that table missing, that doesn't make any sense. I'm going to ask it to do get persistent data. I don't have to remember which of my widgets there are because I just use one, or which of the namespaces. And instead, I'm going to do widget name, and there we go. So this is a quick calculation that will go and reach into that, and it will pull out the correct widget from the persistent storage. People have been asking about it being how fast it is, especially on load. I found this to be nicely faster. It's a calculation, and calculations just render how they render. But it doesn't have to. In my old scenario, I would have to either use that relationship, or I would use a script to go to that HTML table and find the widget that I wanted to work with, and then put that HTML inside of the web viewer via the set web viewer script. I don't need to do that anymore because I have this global context of the persistent data and one of the particular widgets in my case. And now this calculation can be anywhere. For a web viewer, this is great because I don't have to worry about context anymore. Obviously, for this one, I do want this student's information. And as I scroll through, I want the data inside of the widget to reflect that. But if I were building a dashboard, I could have it on any old layout, and using this persistent data would let me find the exact widget that I need to work on. This file here sitting on my desktop, this is a hosted file, by the way. So if I were to, I'll just close it and we'll open it back up and just kind of see how fast it goes. I mean, there, it's available. So it's, did I get the hosted one? I'm not sure if I got the hosted one, actually. Now that I think about it. There it is. Okay, we'll do the, let's see. Yeah, that was the one. I'll have to find it here. But doing it that way gives me all of the calculation possibilities that's available to me. For me, the slowest part now is still fetching the data. So I have to do that on server, and I have to use mechanisms to do that. But strictly from rendering this HTML, it is all coming from that persistent cache. So starting this up, going to a layout where a web viewer is reading that is pretty instantaneous. There is no delay in the web viewer itself rendering. There is a delay in, of course, fetching the data, but that's just because fetching the data is the slowest part of working with a web viewer and a widget. But that is, I didn't mention this. Sitting on my desktop, this file, when I removed the HTML table and the table occurrences and all that data that was in the HTML table, it reduced it about 0.8 of a megabyte. So there's still some size to this. Adding the HTML, these 10 different widgets composed of 220 or so thousand characters each. So 2 million characters inside of that area. It's still a hefty amount. It still added maybe 5 megabytes worth of file size to it by putting it into the data storage area, but it's certainly less than, in my very unscientific test, it's less than putting the data into an actual data table. And of course, I don't have those table occurrences anymore. I don't have those tables anymore. So this is as a FileMaker developer who works in JavaScript, building a widget, storing it in the persistent data storage is by far superior because I don't need to worry about it. I'll say one last thing about my process. Whenever I code a widget, I'm building it in VS Code or I'm building it in Claude or whatever. I have a mechanism in my setup to compile the code and bring it over into FileMaker. It brings it over by triggering this script, upload to HTML. This upload to HTML goes to the file, it opens the file, and it simply inserts that code that it put into this variable from the compiled HTML file, and it puts it into this data store. So if my client says, hey, Jeremy, I would like these to be, red instead of purple, I can make the change over in the code, and then I can deploy it, and that just goes right in. It overwrites the purple and all of the code there, and it produces a new version. So this is so much more efficient, and I'm about efficiency. We still have to use a script to get to this. So I couldn't use like a layout object I guess I could put my code on a layout object and then use a script to do that. But this script stays forever and ever. Every time I need to add a new widget or I need to change a widget, this one is invoked by the VS Code by my process, and it is setting that data into the one place. Before doing that, I had to do a whole rigmarole to find the code. In this case, I have a widget coming in called, honor roll. It has to go to that HTML table. It has to see if it exists. If it doesn't exist, create a new one. If it does exist, let's just overwrite it with the updated code. So this is just a bunch of context that I don't have to fuss with anymore using the persistent data storage. So that is how I see it. It works only in this local file. I can't have another file access this via a calculation. I have to do it via a script, but that is, so I see this as a great advantage for it. And as soon as clients that I work with are up to FileMaker 2026, I will use this instead of asking my clients to add a HTML table to their files that doesn't really mean anything. It's just wasted space, in my opinion, now. So,
Right.
All right. So that was my
great.
use of it.
Thanks, Jeremy. That is actually, to me, pretty compelling. And I just want to reiterate, I think something we said quickly in passing at the beginning, and this has been a big question throughout, is like, why make this change to storing things like preferences? Or, for, as Jeremy demoed, JavaScript widgets that are driving the UI in his app that he demoed. And I think the single biggest reason is persistent data survives cloning. So if you're using a workflow like the data migration tool to move code from a build, test, deploy kind of workflow, previously you had to have extra work. You had to do a lot of extra work to make sure that HTML table migrated with your clone. Whereas when you use the persistent data store, you update that interface code in the persistent data store, save your clone, and now it's import your data or do whatever other updates you do, and it's there. Right?
That's a
Yes.
another great use case scenario. Yeah.
And certainly in my scenario, that was always a problem because I would be testing in my client's development file and we'd get it all pretty and nice in there. And then when they wanted to deploy it, they would have to manually copy all the HTML over to that or import or build a script to do that. Now we don't have to do that. The work that I do in the HTML can easily flow to the production, just like the new themes or styles that the developer whose file this is working on.
Yep. And I'm just going to call out, it's 10 to 12 where I am. There's a ton of questions. I've opened the closing poll, so before you leave, please do answer the closing questions. Once again, I'll reiterate, the recording will be up on YouTube later today. We're going to stick around and answer as many questions as we can, so we may go a little bit past, but if you need to leave earlier, please go ahead and leave earlier. And I'll just say this now so that I catch people. We're not going to have another community live this month. I'm going to be out on vacation for almost 2 weeks at the end of the month. And so we'll be back.
You're allowed.
Yeah, we'll be back in September. So watch your email in the community for notifications of when we start up again after Labor Day in the US.
Good.
All right. So now I think there was a lot of questions, and I think this is a good place to kick off the best practices of is there security around what's written into the persistent data store? Is it controlled by privilege sets at all? Or is it open to any client who can launch the data viewer and start poking around?
It's my understanding that that the script needs full access privileges to get to the data. I haven't tested a lot around that, but I believe that is a caveat. Maybe
because it's a calculation,
yeah.
Anybody who knows what the function is and knows what your name is and the widget, the particular instance ID is, can access that. Obviously, we want everybody to be able to see the company preferences or the HTML code. So it isn't bound, and I don't think any calculations are bound by security privileges. Are there? It's controlling access to the data viewer. That's the only place I think we can see it, right? The data viewer would be the only place that renders it just in its raw form, right?
Right.
My web viewer is going to turn it into HTML, although you could potentially right click on a web viewer and see the source code, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. So you don't want to put secure things in there, I guess. Is that what we're kind of getting to? That's a best practice. We won't want to put API keys in there or passwords or Rosemary's home address or anything.
Funny, we were talking about API keys prior to this meeting, all three of us, right, guys? And we were talking about, API keys in a custom function versus API keys exposed in a field in the schema, as opposed to now in persistent store. Persistent store is available through the save as XML, which I believe is only accessible if you're in with full access anyway. So
but same is true of custom functions, right?
Exactly. Same with but the custom function you can curtail custom function security for users. Like some users won't have access to custom functions if you so choose. So in that sense, there is a little bit more options. But at the end of the day, if you have full access, obviously you'll have access to the API key. But if you don't have full access and it's in persistent store, then the only way you're going to get to that is that you'd have to call the function to get it. And then as far as I know, that function is only available as a full access with a script running full access. Jeremy, why don't we test that real quick? That is right?
Well, a script can be full access. Sure, yeah. So we can turn off full access of it. But I mean, the point of this and the point of what I'm showing is you don't need a script to access this at all, because it's a calculation. And
Right.
yours, right? So,
I think maybe I'm talking about setting persistent data.
oh, setting, sure, yes, yeah,
Mhm.
because it's a script, it should be locked to only full access privileges. Yes, yeah,
For setting it.
and deleting for that matter. You can
Yeah.
delete using the same dialogue. You
Right.
don't want someone to come in there and delete it.
Right.
Another question that's come up is, does it work across other contexts besides in FileMaker Pro through Perform Script on Server, OData, Data API, WebDirect, all of those things?
But for Perform Script on Server, I know for a fact that that works. And if we have time, I can show a demo of that.
WebDirect it would, because it's just a calculation among all of the other calculations that we have available to us now that are, and I don't think I've seen that this function is not, or I don't think that the documents say it's not WebDirect compatible. API, I don't know. I mean, or OData, I think in those instances, you're grabbing actual data out of your file, out of a table, versus like the styles or the themes or something. So I don't know, you probably have more experience than I do on this, but you can't use an OData or Data API to get parts of your FileMaker file, can you?
No, I think
I'm
it's
just looking
limited
at
to data.
I just pulled up help, and the script step to configure persistent data is supported across ProGo, WebDirect Server, Cloud, Data API, and Custom Web Publishing. So the script step is supported.
Okay.
So once that's supported, then the calculation functions will be supported through all of those methods as well.
Yeah. But if someone was calling the Data API and they wanted to get the data inside persistent store, they would most likely do that by way of a script.
Yeah.
And unless Claris eventually opens up those other areas of FileMaker for direct API access.
I
Like
mean,
OData, for example.
Right.
But here again, OData, you think of OData as, okay, that's going direct to the tables.
yeah.
That's the whole premise of OData. So they would have to, I don't know if that would even be the right, it's almost like apples and oranges in that way. But I can see someone wanting that, where they could call OData and then put in a parameter that said, okay, persistent store, and then give the name and then the ID, and then that data comes back from the file. I could see that as a need, but I don't think it exists yet.
Yep. Yeah, and I just want to thank you, Marcelo, for scanning the documentation while we were talking. Marcelo did confirm setting or deleting entries in the persistent data store requires full access privileges, whereas reading entries does not. So
Great.
yeah, so Mark, you were correct on that.
And so
another best practice I would suggest is use meaningful IDs. And you do have to know what you have in the persistent data storage without running a save as copy XML. I would hope that all of our data analysis tools, or DDR analysis tools, will be able to read from the persistent data store and tell us what we have in there. But you do have to know. So if you keep them meaningful, like company preferences, honor roll, widget, whatever you're more likely to remember what it's supposed to do and which one you're supposed to use. I couldn't remember what number 45 meant, or 95. I can't remember what that means, but I can certainly remember what honor roll as an ID means.
Yeah,
and
Mark,
keep it.
Oh, I was just gonna continue that thought with Mark. You work with a team. You have a team of developers. As a team leader, are you evolving any standards for how productive computing as a company is thinking about using persistent data, so that when you have multiple developers working on a application, they're using the same namespace and a consistent pattern for the IDs?
It's so new that we haven't developed standards for it yet. And not all customers are on 26. So, but as those things come about and our developers adopt these new methodologies, we have started using it, but we haven't come up with a standard yet to name them. But I think it's going to be a good practice. And just in case, sometimes we inherit files from other developers that aren't on our team, you can always just save as XML to see all the namespaces and figure out, okay, what were they doing here? What does the landscape look like? That save as XML will be your savior in terms of what's in the file. So you always have that backup as a way to do it. And then the only other weird thing about this that people need to know about is to delete the persistent data. The only way to delete it cleanly is using the same configure persistent data script step that I showed, and there was an option to delete it. All it needs to know is the name and the ID. It'll delete everything in there. And that further reinforces Jeremy's idea of, keep one name and then multiple IDs. That way you have less places to go to delete things or to worry about them. And then I did see a question where someone was asking, can you overwrite the persistent data if you use the same name, the same ID, what happens? And you can just overwrite it. It'll do a straight replace of everything inside.
Okay. So if you did, for example, I saw that question too. If you wanted then instead to do an append, it's just like when you set a variable, right? You're overwriting unless you set it to, hey, give me the value that's already there and whatever you want to append.
Right.
The as of 26.01, the dialogue is a little bit confusing. I keep reading it and I'm a little confused. I don't know if it's been fixed in 2020 in this one that just version that just rolled out. It's talking about how the name you can group them with instance IDs that have a common purpose, and that actually should be you group persistent data storage pieces by name that have a common purpose. So instance IDs have to be unique. You have to have unique ones there, but many instances can fall under the same name. So I don't know, Rosemary, do you know if that language was fixed in the dialogue by chance?
I haven't
Okay.
checked yet. And also, Jeremy, I want to say thank you for sharing in chat, and I just want to call everyone's attention to it. Jeremy did some pretty exhaustive research to prepare. He found all the blog posts from across the community and kind of rolled them up into a single article. And then at the end of that is a bunch of links to all the things that all the community thought leaders and experts have said so far about persistent data.
And Rosemary, we have a place in the community in the Learn Out Loud.
We do.
For this very question. How are you going to use this, or what ideas do you have? We always know that Claris releases a feature and then with a particular use case in mind, but we all go crazy and we figure out great things to do with it. So that community post is would be a great place that if you discover a fun, unique way, you can put your thoughts in there as well so that other people are inspired. I think that's important to do for these new features that come out that we're like, what do we do with them? So.
Yep. Yep. And again, I'm having problems getting anything into chat, so I will be sure to drop that link in the community, or Jeremy, if you want to drop it into chat.
Find it.
If you can.
One thing I'll also say is since it's a calculation, Mark showed this, he mentioned it too. I'm going to refresh the window so that the calculation updates. That's an important piece of this, even in a web viewer. If I, as the developer, change the color of my cards in the web viewer from purple to pink, no one will see that unless they resize the layout, unless they cause the layout to refresh. So I don't think that matters too much. I don't know. That's a key that you have to think about. If people are in the middle of seeing your layout calculation with the persistent data, they're not going to see any updates that you or people make via a script to it until their layout is refreshed. So,
and
it's just a regular layout calculation.
That's a great comment, Jeremy. And I'll also add to that, because it came up as a question here in the chat. If I update the persistent data, user A over here in Michigan, updates their persistent data by way of a script. They hit save, and it's immediately available to all users connected to that file. Immediate, just as fast as it would be if they set a field. So if they retrieve that persistent data a second later after it's been added, it's available to all users. So that's a very powerful way to distribute information. In the same way that we distribute schema through fields and tables and layouts, persistent data is amazing. And that's why it's so good as a way to store server-side scripting. So you collect all your data server-side, throw it in the persistent store, and it's available immediately on the client side. And then that breaks the limitation of the 1 million characters that we have today as developers. You can only move 1 million characters back and forth through a script parameter by way of server-side scripting. This breaks all of that and makes it something really possible now.
Another thing is the actual script to set or remove or update the persistent data. I know what I do. Like, I'm going to have one that's going to upload to my HTML, and so I'm going to keep it in every file. But Mark, doesn't this sound like sort of a kind of a setup thing where you're going to set up the preferences once, probably your entire time, and then you're done with that script? Would you keep that script that sets the preferences, or would you just delete that script? Does that seem like a silly thing to have a script to do one little thing and then dump it and get rid of that script?
I'd probably keep it in the same way that we have utility scripts that set up sample data, or a utility script that wipes all the data out during a demo. Yeah, I'd probably keep it and put it in the utilities folder. And then I would definitely keep a script that involved where the users are going to be changing their own preferences on a regular basis. Then obviously those scripts will be production scripts. So yeah, I think it's kind of a little of both. But technically speaking, yeah, you could set the data and forget it and say that's what it is, and I never need to set it again. Like for the Jeremy specific, developer-esque environment, sure, I could see that set and forget.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there was a little bit of a conversation about that, like how in the chat, how is this an advantage? And I think, like you've pointed out, for things that don't change often or at all, like a company preferences or a user's preferences, you're setting that once it travels with the file, and then you're not refreshing it on open every time someone accesses the file. So that's going to make files feel like they're going to open a little faster.
Yep.
Right.
It's one less script to run on open. Yeah.
Right. You're only accessing it when you need it. You don't have to set up a giant pomp and circumstance when the file opens up. With every
and you don't have to have your data
username.
You don't have to have your data viewer filled with all these global variables.
Username, location, the millions of things that we do to set up. Even the navigation could be done that way. We have navigation preferences, which buttons are going to show, which ones are going to hide. There's miles and miles of preferences data that we typically set up in the opening script.
You could have a individual preferences name, data namespace, and then as each person logs in, you're getting their account name and you're checking to see, does that person have any individual preferences in the data store? If it does, let's render those. If it doesn't, give them the generic version. One thing I'll say is if when you try to get persistent data of an instance ID that doesn't exist, you'll get a question mark back as a result. I wish it were just blank, like JSON set get element, and if it doesn't exist, we get back nothing. Right? Is that right? I always forget because sometimes I get the question mark and sometimes I don't. So I don't know. I would prefer it be empty, but for now it's a question mark.
Yeah. So what you're saying is to capture any errors of empty persistent data, just capture the question mark.
Don't capture is empty. Yeah, because that's not true. Question mark is not empty.
Right.
I've gotten caught on that a few times in this exploration.
Yeah. But I really like it. There's a lot of developers out there that collect massive amounts of data on the server and then bring it back to the client for rendering inside a web viewer. And the limitation of that 1 million characters is a real thing. So you have to either do it in batches or store it in a field, which is fine. It works. You can store it in a field, but that's, more overhead. Okay, I got to go to the layout. I got to create a new record, put it in the field. It's just more work, and it's just extra overhead that's not needed anymore for certain things. I mean, if my rule is whether to use it or not is if the user needs to see data on a regular basis where you want them to go to preferences, you want them to see the preferences, you want it in a portal that can sort, you can either use that in a web viewer or use it, in traditional schema. But there's so many preferences as developers that we don't need the users to see just to make the environment happy, that this is like a perfect place for that. And there's no reason to create a bunch of schema that the users will never need to see anymore.
I just thought of something, a good use case. I often work in systems where every time you open a new layout, it immediately runs a set window preferences or set window shape or size or title. All of that could be pushed into the data store. Possibly. You don't need a subscript. I don't know. I'm not sure, but you might not need a subscript. Maybe a window could pull the information it needs, the window itself, as you're creating a new window, from the data store itself.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like I was saying, navigational preferences, window sizes, all those things that we do tend to store in global variables. Important things to know about, but yeah. And I do like the idea of using a JSON construct like you've done and you see me do. That's just a wonderful way to put in a bunch of data into one place because there's really no limitations in the same way that there'd be limitations using other techniques.
If you're well versed in JSON, this data store is kind of a JSON structure anyway, right? You've got the JSON get element, the name, so that would be the object that you're looking for, and then the property, the instance ID. So that's how I'm thinking of it. Even though it's structured differently, it's the same construct. So it's the same idea.
Same concept, exactly.
Yeah. And I think I'm going to take one last question, and then we probably do need to wrap up. This late breaking question is, so you have to run the script to set the persistent data every time you open the file?
No.
Just
that's the beauty. That's the beauty of persistent data. Once you store it, it's in the file until you change it or delete it.
Right. And so, and then grabbing the data, you're doing it with a calculation. You may be doing it in a script, but you're grabbing it to display just as you need it.
Right.
Well, thank you so much, Jeremy. Thank you, Mark. It was good to see both of you. And as we wrap up, I am going to just say Jeremy has been on my short list for guests since we started doing Community Live 2 years ago. So thanks, Jeremy, I'm glad the stars aligned and we could finally get together and have you on. So I hope everyone has a good rest of August, summer in the Northern Hemisphere. And if you're watching late at night or watching the recording, I hope your fall and going into end of winter, going into spring in the Southern Hemisphere is also very, very lovely. So thank you again, and we will see all of you in September. Bye, everyone.
Thanks.